Today's story is all about root biology. Underground transportation networks, special deals with bacteria and fungi is just the beginning of what makes plant roots so interesting. Plant roots act as the anchor. If plants didn't have roots, in strong winds they would topple over, and in large rainstorms they would wash away. Plant roots also act as the Amazon prime for a plant. What I mean by that is if plants need certain nutrients or more water, the roots can grow and gather that nutrient, or more water. Plant roots also act as a guard for the plant. What I mean by that is that plants are interacting with a lot of bacteria and fungi and viruses in the soil and other organisms. They need to detect who's safe and who's unsafe to enter the roots, or else the plant could be attacked. Plant roots also act as a spy. They have a lot of surface area. They're touching a lot of soil. That soil has the available nutrients and water that the plant needs to grow. If water levels are getting low, that root system, which is the spy for the plant, needs to signal to the above ground plant and say, hey, slow down growth. It's getting dry here. Or there's really not enough nutrients, so we need to hold back in our growth. The plant's root system doesn't call the above ground plant, but it signals using plant hormones. Plant roots also can act as a storage for the plant system to store carbohydrates for use in the next season. We care about roots because they play an essential role in plant development, but a lot of times we don't get our hands dirty, literally, to take the time to understand root development. Our goal for today is to dig down into the soil to understand how root development occurs and why it's essential for plant growth. After this lecture, I want you to see plants around you and not just think about the above ground growth, but what's happening underneath to make that plant so successful. We're going to take the time to realize that there's a lot going on underneath the soil in the root systems. Scientists study roots less than other parts of the plant, and part of the reason is because it's challenging to study roots. When you dig up a beautiful 3D dimensional root system, it often looks like a mat of hair. Same as a beautiful jellyfish in the ocean, but once it washes up on shore, it just looks like a blob. It's hard to visualize roots, but scientists are working tirelessly to figure out new techniques. Of course, we have the good old-fashioned shovel to dig up root systems, but it can be hard because root systems grow very deep and can be easily damaged. Some innovative scientists, like Dr. Septi, have developed a technique of growing rice plants in a colander. That way, when the root system grows out, the colander kind of protects the root system so that it's easier to dig up later. Other scientists will grow plants in paper towel rolls so that the roots are easier to clean. Or grow the plants in auger. Systems such as rhizotrons have also been developed. This is a great way to visualize roots. What you do is you make a very thin rectangular pot, usually with plastic on the outside. You put a very thin layer of soil in that, and then you plant your seeds. It's important that you put the rhizotron at a slight angle, because roots grow downward. Once they grow downward, they'll hit the side of the wall, and then they'll grow along the wall. Once you uncover that, you can see the root system beautifully. It's important to cover up the size of the rhizotron while the plants are growing, however, because if plant roots get light, they'll start photosynthesizing, which is not natural. There's other systems, such as this software called WinRhizo, that's been developed to quantify roots. It's easy to see a root system, but to count every root tip or how long it is exactly can be very challenging. WinRhizo does this for scientists, being able to quantify root surface area, root length, number of root tips, and other variables. Other scientists have developed luminescent techniques to visualize roots. This is an Arabidopsis plant that you can see, even though it's a quite short plant, has a huge root system that we're just beginning to understand. So what makes up a good root system? Looking at roots is important for detecting if a plant is healthy. I'll never forget when my professor, Dr. Thomas Isaacitz, told me that the best plant pathologists take time to look at the roots. Plant pathologists are plant doctors. They detect what is wrong with the plant. For instance, both of these plants are coffee seedlings. One of them has been infected with nematodes, whereas the other is healthy. It's important to look at the roots, or else you would plant these plants, and one of them would be very productive, whereas the other one would produce very little coffee. Different plants have different strategies on how to grow their root systems. Some cactus, for instance, have very shallow root systems, so when it rains, they can gather a ton of water and then store it in their succulent stems, their swollen stems. Other plants have deep root systems so that they can get available groundwater. Different strategies work for different plants. Just because a plant is really short, you don't know how big the root system is. Different plants have different strategies on how to build their root systems. Think of a root system as an architecture deciding how to build a building. There's different strategies on what materials to use and how to build and design the building. Root systems are the same way. It's not free for the plant to build a root system, so they have to be smart in how they build their networks. Some plants have a taproot, such as a carrot. It's the primary root and it does not substantially branch, so you have this main primary root with other branches off of it, which are called lateral roots. Some examples are carrots and dandelions. Other plants have fibrous root systems, such as grasses. Fibrous root systems are great for preventing erosion because they have a huge net-like system that holds soil in place. That way, when it rains a lot or a strong wind comes, the soil does not wash or blow away. Another plant with a fibrous root system is lilies, and another example is a spider plant. You'll notice that this plant has many branching roots. You'll also notice that some of the roots are a bit swollen. That's because spider plants have an adaptation called succulents in the root systems. The same succulents that you hear in the name of succulent plants. Succulent plants have much thicker leaves than other plants. That's because they're storing water in those leaves. Spider plants do not have succulents in their leaves, but in their root system, so that when it doesn't rain for a while, they can conserve water and use that water that they have stored in their roots. This is a great drought tolerance mechanism. Another type of plant roots that we're going to go over is adventitious roots. Adventitious roots are roots that grow from any tissue other than root tissue, so they can grow from the stem or from a leaf. A lot of succulent plants do this. When times are rough, the plant wants to start growing new roots to gather nutrients and water from a different location. As these roots develop, they can start gathering that. If it's in a proper place, the plant can be cut off from the mother plant and start a whole new clone. It'll have the same genetics as the other mother plant, but it will be self-sufficient. Let's get back to talking about root strategy. If you have deep root systems, you can gather water from deeper down, and you're more stable when the wind blows. This is a comparison of a rice plant that has deep rooting gene 1 and one that doesn't. Scientists have discovered this gene, which is incredibly important because as we need to feed more people, it's important that our plants are drought tolerant, so that when the dry season is prolonged, plants will still survive and produce food for people. We're going to now talk about root growth. Roots grow from the tip. They have multiple tips that all grow from extension. Let's watch this video. Note that this is the root tip. This root tip extends into the soil, continuing to get longer. If you watch the lateral roots, you'll see the same thing. Growing from the tip. We're now going to talk about the anatomy of a root. This is a cross-section of a root. You can think of a root as a plastic straw. This outer edge, which would be the plastic in a straw, is the epidermis, the outer edge. Step in, we have the cortex, which is this light orange color. And this middle blue area is where water and nutrients and sugars flow, and we call this the vasculature. This is a cross-section of a root tip. Remember in the video we saw the root tip extending? Understanding this cross-section will better equip you to understand how that works. This area at the bottom has a root cap, which is essential because roots are penetrating hard soils and sometimes even concrete. This root cap is a protective layer of cells that produces a matrix, a lubricant, that pushes the root through the soil. This root cap is essential for protecting the rest of the root. In this area, right underneath the root cap, is where cells are dividing. Above where the cells are dividing is where the cells are elongating. This elongation of cells is then pushing the newly divided cells further into the soil to extend the root. In this area, we have the area of maturation, which is where the root can start uptaking water. When you have root water uptake, you need root hairs. That was a lot of information, so let's review. At the tip, we have the root cap, which is made up of a layer of cells that prevents damage to the rest of the root as it pushes through the soil. Here we also have the zone of division, which is where cells divide. In the elongation zone is where cells elongate, and in the maturation zone is where water and nutrients are absorbed. This diagram has a lot more information. I don't want you to get overwhelmed, but I want to go over a few things. In the maturation zone, root hairs are produced, and functional xylem and phloem are present, since you need to transport that water that the root hairs are uptaking. In the cell elongation zone, the xylem is just starting to develop, but the phloem is mature. The phloem is mature because it's important to transport the sugars made in the leaves through photosynthesis to these newly dividing and elongating cells. In the cell division zone, the apical meristem and the root cap are present. Remember, the root cap is essential for the root to be able to push through the strong soil. Now we're going to talk about water uptake in roots. I told you that roots are kind of like a straw. Have you ever been using a plastic straw that was cracked? It was pretty hard to get the liquid up, right? Same goes for roots. It's more efficient if roots mainly uptake water near the root tips. So think of all the tips of a root as ends of straws. This makes the root work a lot more efficiently. You can see that in this graph, the y-axis is water uptake, and the x-axis is distant from the root tip. At the very tip, you're not uptaking very much water because the cells are dividing and elongating. But in this region, the maturation zone, where the root hairs are just developed and uptaking water, there's a lot of water uptake. But as you get further away from the root tip, water uptake substantially goes down. So just like the straw, if roots took up water everywhere, it would be a lot less efficient. But roots uptake water mainly at the root tips, which allows the vacuum to work really well. Some studies have shown that 95% of water enters through the root hairs. Let's take a closer look on how the water enters the roots. Roots often absorb water through the root hairs. The water can then transport through the cortex between cells, which is called apoplastically, or symplastically, which is through the cells or through the cell membrane. Once it enters this layer, however, it is forced to go into the cells because it hits the endodermis, which we'll talk about in a second. On the outside, we learned that this is the epidermis. Let's talk about the root epidermis. The root epidermis is this outermost single layer of cells that protects the plant from diseases and absorbs water and nutrients. The epidermis can extend, which becomes a root hair. Root hairs are tubular extensions of the epidermis. Root hairs are really important for increasing the surface area so that the root can absorb more water and nutrients. But interestingly, root hairs only live a few weeks. That's because roots work as a straw, as we discussed before. Let's pretend this carrot is a root tip. As the root is growing, it goes deeper into the soil because the tip is extending, right? As we have here, we'll pretend this is the zone of division. This is the elongation zone. And this is the zone of maturation, where the root hairs form. Okay, my fingers are the root hairs. As the tip extends further into the soil, let's pretend it went down, these root hairs are getting older, say around 3 weeks old. They die off. But at the same time, the zone that used to be the elongation zone, which is now the maturation zone, have new root hairs forming. These new root hairs are interacting with new soil and can absorb nutrients in a new area. This is really interesting because the root hairs dying is actually a part of the process that makes roots work as a straw. So the older root hairs die and new root hairs are formed. As the tip is extending deeper into the soil, root hairs are being turned over, or new ones are being made and old ones are dying off. And this helps root hairs constantly contact fresh soil, ensuring a steady supply of nutrients and water for the plant. Let's go in a layer deeper, into the cortex. This area is where the plant stores sugar and other substances. A layer in is the endodermis. In the endodermis, something really important is happening. So, a little review. We have the epidermis, then we have the cortex, and then the endodermis. The cortex is usually quite a few more cells, but in this graphics, it's only one. In the endodermis, you see this pink layer, which is the Casparian strip. The Casparian strip is in the endodermis, and it's in a water-impermeable strip of waxy material. This helps control the uptake of minerals and water into the xylem. Next, we have the vasculature, or stele. This is where the important pipes are that allow plants to transport sugars and water and nutrients. The xylem works to transport water, and the phloem transports sugars. The organization of xylem and phloem are different in different types of plants. For example, in a dicot, you have this X, which is where the xylem is located. The purple cells are the xylem, where around them there is the phloem. In this graphic, this is an example of a dicot. You have xylem and then phloem on the outside. On a monocot, however, the organization of the xylem and phloem is a little bit less organized. You'll have the xylem, which is the larger vesicles, and then smaller phloem. If you're looking at a cross-section of a root, you can tell if the plant is a monocot or a dicot. If you see the X, it's a dicot. In addition to the xylem and phloem, you also have the pericycle. The pericycle in this dicot is right here, whereas in the monocot, it's right here. The inner cells right after the endodermis. These pericycles are incredibly important for the formation of lateral roots. Cells in the pericycle will start to divide, and eventually, as it gets larger, will start to push through the cortex layer and form a lateral root. Think of it as the plant deciding it needs another straw. It's this another lateral branch off the primary root. These roots are called lateral roots. How do they form? By division of cells in the pericycle. Root biologists have developed a way to keep straight which lateral root you're talking about. For example, this is a primary root of a plant. If you have a lateral root branching off of that, you call that LR1. It's the first lateral root off of that primary root. If you have a lateral root on a lateral root, we call that LR2. If we have a lateral root off of a lateral root that's off of a lateral root, we call that LR3. There's a lot of other naming systems for roots because there's a lot of different root parts. Just if you just said that you're doing a research project on above ground plants, someone would want to know if you're working with the leaves, the buds, the flowers, or the stem. Same goes for roots. There's a lot of different parts, so it's important to tell people what part you're working on. The International Society for Root Research has developed a great key for deciding which roots you're working with. They have a key for both a monocot and a dicot, and the abbreviations are found here. Root tissues are extremely diverse. Roots can also respond to environmental stimuli, meaning that they can change in real time in response to things that are happening in the environment. That could be the level of nutrients, the amount of water that's available. Plants that are closely related can also have very different root systems. Different plant genotypes or different cultivars or varieties can have different root systems, making them more adapted for certain environmental conditions, such as drought. Microbes can also influence how roots grow. Let's go through some examples. Roots can respond to what nutrients are in the soil, because they need to be the Amazon prime to get that nutrient that the plant needs. Phosphorus is a nutrient that plants need to grow. If a plant is grown in a soil that has lots of phosphorus, It has a root, but the root isn't very long and the root hairs are not very long. But if that plant is stressed because it's grown in a soil that has low phosphorus, the root hairs have to do all they can to gather as much phosphorus as possible, so they get longer and the root gets longer to gather as much nutrients as you can. So you'll see the root tip is extending, getting longer faster, and the root hairs are longer as well. Because this plant has low phosphorus, it's doing all it can to gather the phosphorus that the plant needs. Roots can also grow in response to water availability. For a long time, scientists didn't understand how deep roots could really go. Because when you have a shovel and you're digging up a root, you might just go this far. If you go further, you'd say, there's not much roots very deep. But if you go even deeper, you can see that this root is gathering water in this area that has more water availability, say a water table here. This is incredible to see that plant roots can respond to water availability and grow more roots there. It's like having more buses in an area where more students need to go, or having a train system to an area which grows food so that it can be transported back to the city. Roots are a transportation system to gather the nutrients and water that the plant needs. Even plants that are very closely related can have different root development. For example, these are some microscope images that I took of two different wheat cultivars. This is one plant and this is the other. You can see that this one has root hairs that are closer to the tip. That means in the maturation zone, the root hairs are forming faster, and the root hairs are much longer compared to this one. This plant, interestingly, is much more drought tolerant, so that you can see that root hair development and root development in general plays a huge role in the plant's ability to withstand drought. Traits like this are important for plant breeders to look at so that we can have plants that grow more food with less water. Roots can also respond to microorganisms that are in the soil. These are some wheat roots that I inoculated with a beneficial bacteria. You can see that the roots are a lot longer. As you can see the same thing in this picture, that the presence of the organism can influence root growth. In summary, today we talked about the hidden side of plants, root development. This exciting place that transports water, nutrients, and is essential for holding down the plant and making sure the plant grows healthy. We talked about the different root systems, fibrous root systems and taproot systems, and how some plants have deep roots and some have shallow for different strategies. We also talked about the internal structure of roots, the root anatomy. And we talked about root growth zones, root hairs, lateral roots, and water uptake. We learned that roots are non-uniform and continuously changing based on environmental conditions. I hope that today introduced you to how important roots are and how they need to be involved in every study of plant science. Please comment with any questions or ideas for future videos. I hope you have a great day.